high, love.
Astronomers, we get to think about a lot of the same cool stuff that astronauts do, but they get the really fun part of actually going up into space. But as Alvin explained, I'm very fortunate, even though I've never gotten to go to space myself. My books have, so that's almost as good. Not quite. I don't get to do all the fun stuff myself, but I do know that my books are going 17,000 miles an hour right now. Luckily, not this one, which I'm going to read to you. Otherwise, it'd be hard to keep up with it. So what I'm going to try to do this morning is give you or this afternoon, is give you a very brief reading of Max Goes to the Moon. The story involves my dog, Max, who you can see here. And there's Max. Now, he, of course, did not really go into space. There have been dogs in space. In fact, the first living creature to go into space was a dog, Russian dog named Laika. But Max did not really go into space. However, he was a real dog, as you can see there in the picture, and he was a very large dog, as you can tell. But you can probably also see that he was a very friendly dog. The book starts with a dedication page. It says, "To children around the world, follow your dreams, study hard, and someday you'll live in a world as wonderful as the one we imagine in this book." And of course, it says imagine because it's not a true story, but the type that could come true, hopefully in not too long. This is the story of how Max the dog helped people return to the moon, this time to stay. It all began on the morning of the parade. Max had just returned from his trip to the space station. He was a hero, and everyone wanted to share in his adventures. As Max's car drove along Pearl Street, Max looked to the west and he began to howl just as the moon set over the mountains. In truth, Max howled because he heard a siren. He always howls at sirens. But the TV reporters didn't know that, so they thought he was howling at the moon. A reporter spotted Max's friend, Tori. "Why did Max howl at the moon?" he asked. "I'm not sure," said Tori. "Maybe it's because he wants to go there." Now, if you look at this painting here, so the sides of the pages, there's these boxes, we call them big kid boxes, and they explain all the science that's going on behind the scenes of the story. Now, I obviously don't have time to read you all those today, but we'll be talking about a couple of the things in them. In this particular painting, there's Max and Tori, there's the reporter who asked the question. Up on the hill there, you might notice there's an ambulance, which is where the siren was coming from, which is what he's really howling at, but they thought he was howling at the moon. And if you look here, you'll see that moon in the morning sky. And if you look very closely, I know it's very difficult to see where you are in the back, but those of you in the front can tell that that moon is not quite a full moon, but it's definitely more than half of the moon that you're seeing. So it's in between half and full, which has a very, very special name that for some reason hardly anybody knows. Anybody know what it is? Yeah. Oh, I heard a few people with it. Gibbous. How many people knew that? Oh, you guys are a great audience because most people don't know this one. But I want to make sure that if you don't know it, you will, and that other people around the building might learn it too. So if I can get everybody to very quietly stand up, please. You got to participate even if you're a grown-up. If you stand up and show me with your arms a full moon. Okay, we all know full moon. Can you show me with your arms a crescent moon? Okay, crescent's pretty easy. Now we want to do gibbous. So to make our gibbous moon, we go full, and now we take out a little bit. It's kind of the exact opposite of a crescent. Crescent has a little bit of bright, all the rest dark. Gibbous has mostly bright, little bit of dark. So what do we call it? Gibbous. Again. Gibbous. Louder. Gibbous. Louder. Do you really think that people at the White House heard you that time? Come on the count of three, I want the White House to hear about the gibbous moon. 1, 2, 3. Yeah! Much better, much better. Now back to our story, of course. Tori said maybe he wants to go to the moon. Well, Tori's maybe was good enough for TV. By the next day, Max's dream of going to the moon was all over the news. And because no one had been to the moon in a long time, it seemed like it was about time for someone, or some dog, to go. It's not easy to go to the moon. It takes big rocket engines to get a spaceship off the Earth. It takes careful planning to make sure the astronauts reach the moon and come back safely, and it costs a lot of money. But everywhere Max went, crowds chanted, "Send Max to the moon." People wrote letters to the president. So a new moonship was built, and assembled at the space station. So in this painting, you can see the space station there, and the astronauts out there, just like Alvin Drew was when he did his spacewalk, except for he was not riding on that, the other guy was. And here's this moon ship that they've built. Of course, it's not really existing yet, but in the story, we're in the future. And you can see the 4 legs that it will use to land down on the surface. Tori gave Max the good news. "You are going to the moon," she said. "I sure hope they let me come with you." Max went into astronaut training again. The other astronauts were glad to have Max back. Max made the long training sessions seem fun. Somehow he always managed to find a stick. He loved to play fetch while the astronauts trained in the water tank. He also loved to play tug-of-war. And guess who always won? So this is a painting of the actual water tank down in Houston where the astronauts do train for their missions. And you can see Max didn't really go there, but we painted him in. It's like he was there playing along. Tori thought Max should know a little history before his trip, so she told Max about the first astronauts who went to the moon. "Listen carefully, Max. Neil Armstrong and Buzz Aldrin were the first people to walk on the moon. Their mission was called Apollo 11. They landed on the moon on July 20th, 1969. Neil Armstrong stepped out first. Do you know what he said when he took his first moon step? He said, 'That's one small step for a man, one giant leap for mankind.' Do you understand, Max?" Max barked, and Tori took that as a yes. "Good boy, Max," said Tori. So in this painting, you see what it really did look like more than 40 years ago, 45 years ago now, when the first 2 astronauts landed on the moon, Neil Armstrong and Buzz Aldrin. So there they are. That's the lunar lander that they took to the moon. There's the flag that they planted on the moon. And if you think about it, you might realize that that flag looks like it's doing something that it really should not be doing on the moon. What's that? Looks like it's waving, and why shouldn't it be? Because there's no air and no wind on the moon. So it can't really be waving, even though it kind of looks like it is, and it's staying up like that. So in that case, you might be thinking, well, in that case, if it can't really be waving, why is it staying up instead of falling down? And I see that a lot of people here have hands up, and you know the answer, but that's okay, because I don't want you to tell me the right answer, because I want to tell you the wrong answer. Usually I do this talk just with kids. There's a lot of adults here. I have to apologize in advance for embarrassing you all. But the reason I tell the kids the wrong answer is because, embarrassingly, it's what a lot of adults think. Now, hopefully you're not those adults, but maybe you are. And kids, you understand this situation because you've dealt with it before. You probably know very often you run into situations where adults have some trouble with science and you have to straighten them out, right? This is one of those situations. Because adults, they say the craziest things about this flag. For example, a lot of adults, you ask them why the flag stays up, they'll say something ridiculous like, well, there's no gravity on the moon. Pretty crazy, huh? I mean, look at the picture. Pretty darn obvious that there's gravity on the moon, right? How do you know? Because the astronauts are standing. They're not floating off. If there was no gravity on the moon, they'd be floating off. Obviously, there is gravity on the moon. So this brings us to a very, very important point, kids. If you're ever anywhere and some grown-up tries to tell you that there's no gravity on the moon, please don't laugh too hard. It will hurt their feelings. It's okay to laugh a little bit because it's so silly. But then you just say, oh, silly grown-up. Of course there's gravity on the moon. Otherwise the astronauts would be floating away. And the grown-up might then say, oh, good point. Glad you straightened me out. But then why is the flag staying up? And you say, well, duh, because they stuck a pole through it so it wouldn't fall down. NASA chose 6 experienced astronauts to go to the moon with Max. Since Max and Tori made such a good team, Tori got to go along too. So the crew of 7 humans and 1 dog blasted off into space. Within a few hours, their ship was docked at the space station, where their moonship was waiting. After lunch on the space station, the crew boarded the moonship. The crew fired the moonship's rocket engines to gain speed, leaving Earth orbit. Once on their way, they turned off the engines and coasted toward the moon. The trip took a little more than 2 days. Soon, the moon loomed large in the window, with Earth far behind. The crew turned the ship around, so firing the rocket engines slowed it down. As the moonship neared the surface, the blast from its engines kicked up a cloud of moon dust. Then it settled gently onto the moon. Max was so excited about reaching the moon that the crew had a hard time getting his spacesuit on. It took 3 of them just to hold Max, while the others pulled the spacesuit over his legs. Tori made sure that Max's tail went in the right place. Then they closed all the buckles and attached his helmet. Finally, they checked carefully to make sure that the spacesuit was airtight. When they opened the airlock, Max jumped out. You should have seen the look on his face. He went much higher and farther than he had expected. It also took him much longer to come down than he was used to on Earth. Tori watched out the window and said, "That's one giant leap for a dog." Now, we know there is gravity on the moon, and yet he goes much higher and farther than he was expecting to from what he's used to on Earth. So there must be something different about gravity on the moon. What is it? Everybody. Less gravity on the moon. So if I can get you all to stand up again, very carefully and quietly, and on the count of 3, I need everybody to jump as high as they can. 1, 2, 3. We'll do it again. 1, 2, 3. And one more time. 1, 2, 3. Okay, and now you can sit back down. And you're all very good jumpers. And I noticed that most of you, when you jump, maybe you get your feet about 2 feet off the ground, like that. Now, it turns out that on the moon, gravity is 1/6 as strong. And therefore, you can jump 6 times as high. So on the moon, gravity would bring you back down just like it does on Earth, but before it did, you'd get a little higher. How much higher? 6 times as high. So if you jump 2 feet off the ground here on Earth, on the moon, your feet would have gotten 12 feet off the ground, which is up near the top of that screen there. Also happens to be higher than a basketball hoop, which is 10 feet off the ground, which means if you were playing basketball on the moon, every single one of you could not only dunk the basketball, you could jump your feet completely over the hoop. For posterity, the astronauts fenced off the spot where Max made his first paw prints on the moon. There is no wind or rain on the moon, so those paw prints are still there today, even though it has been many years since Max's first moon trip. Max thought it would be fun to play with a stick. He didn't see any, so he decided to look behind a big rock. But when he poked his head into the rock's shadow, it was darker than the darkest night, and cold, too. Max leaped backward with a look of surprise and worry. Tori bounded over to calm him down. "It's okay, Max, you're a good dog. Just try to stay out of the shadows. Anyway, you won't find any sticks on the moon. Nothing lives here, so there aren't any trees. Here, I brought a frisbee to play with," and there you can see her pulling the frisbee out of her pack. Tori got off a good throw, even though her big spacesuit glove made it a little hard to hold the frisbee. Max bounded after it, but it didn't curve the way Max expected, and he missed it by a lot. Tori quickly realized why Max was confused. He didn't know that objects move differently when there's no air. Tori picked up a rock and pulled a feather from her pack. "Look at this feather," she explained to Max. "On Earth, the air would make it float gently to the ground. But there's no air here on the moon, so it falls straight down, plunk, just like the rock." And in fact, in the box there's a little link to a NASA video from the Apollo 15 mission where they actually did this experiment with a feather and a hammer rather than a rock. Tori picked up the frisbee and threw it again. This time, Max knew what to do. She threw it very high, so Max had time to get under it. He stopped and turned around to see the frisbee coming down. He was perfectly positioned for the catch. There was only one problem. Max, Tori, and the astronauts had plenty of work to do for the next few days. They collected moon rocks for science, and they set up telescopes to study distant planets and stars. But most of all, they loved gazing upward at the Earth, which seemed to hang in one place in the sky. And so we live here on the Earth. We look up in the sky, and we see the moon, and we see the moon going through its phases every month, or some people prefer to call it month. But it's really a month, don't forget. That's the cycle of the lunar phases. And if you were on the moon, you would look up in the sky and you would see Earth. And you would see Earth going through phases every month. Maybe they would change the name to an Earth. And what kind of Earth is that? Crescent Earth. Right. Soon, the longer shadows told Max and the crew that darkness was coming. It was time to leave. Once everyone was aboard the moonship, Max and Tori waved goodbye to the moon. And the crew closed the door. They fired the rocket engines and blasted off the moon. Just 12 days after leaving the Earth, Max, Tori, and the rest of the astronauts were back on the space station. Then, a space shuttle took them home. Back on Earth, billions of people watched Max's trip on the news. Everyone talked about it. Some grown-ups said the trip wasn't worth the money it cost. But children understood the excitement of it all. They asked their parents to help send Max to the moon again, but this time to build a big colony where many children could go visit him and learn about the universe. The children were so convincing that all the nations of the world decided to work together to build a big domed colony on the moon. The domes covered homes, offices, and, of course, the University of the Moon. They were filled with air so that no one needed a spacesuit inside. Food grew in greenhouses and water was carefully recycled. Outside the domes, astronauts built great telescopes to observe the universe. Students and scientists made important new discoveries almost every day. The building of the moon colony also changed a lot of things back on Earth. Children tried to learn more in school in hopes that they might get to attend the University of the Moon. How many of you would like to go to college on the moon? Sounds pretty darn good to me, right? Grown-ups save their money for tourist trips to the moon. Grown-ups, if your kids go to college on the moon, you can go visit them for spring break. More importantly, it's a week-long trip to the moon, right? A couple days there, a couple days back, week there, perfect timing. Most importantly, the beautiful views of Earth from the moon made everyone realize that we all share a small and precious planet. And there in the sky, you can see our small and precious planet in this painting. And if you look closely at our small and precious planet in this particular painting, you'll notice that this time, it's not quite full, but definitely more than half, which makes it gibbous. Again. And on the count of 3 for Congress. 1, 2, 3. Excellent. Of course, none of it would have happened without Max. Max was glad he had been so helpful, but he was not the type of dog to stop at that. It's a big universe out there. Where would he go next? Well, it turns out in my series, he goes next to Mars and then to Jupiter. Space Station is the prequel, and I do have to tell you that while Alvin asked me the question of what he did on the space station, my actual answer was, I don't know, do you have any ideas? So he gave me the idea for that story for Max Goes to the Space Station. He didn't take enough credit there. And there's an activity at the back of the book for learning about the phases of the moon, although you seem to know quite a bit about them already. A little bit more information. So this is just so you get to know the real dog a little bit, since he does star in all these books here. That's when Max was flower dog at a wedding with my daughter and son, and showing that he was so big 2 kids could sit on top of him at the same time. Here you can see that even though he never swam in the actual water tank where the astronauts train, he really did love to swim. He really did howl at sirens. There he is in howling position. And before he became an astronaut, apparently he was thinking about being a reindeer. There is a picture from the Space Shuttle Discovery with Alvin reading Max Goes to the Moon from the computer screen there before we took the real books went up to the space station.
Hi, I'm NASA astronaut Mike Hopkins on board the International Space Station, and it's one of my favorite times. It's story time from space. Now today's story is Max Goes to the Moon, a science adventure with Max the dog.
And so if you go to a Facebook story time from space, you can see some of the photos that have come down already. Please like the program on there, and the full videos of the readings will be up sometime fairly soon. There is also a planetarium show of Max Goes to the Moon, and those are all of my books, or some of my books.